Okay, well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Sekforde Society. Before I introduce our guest speaker, Sir Robert Boyd and his family tonight, I just wanted to say something about the Sekforde Society. This is an informal society that has been formed by me and my dear friend Hadi Samadi. He's multi-talented, as you see. He's operating the camera tonight. And the idea is that we will have a forum for interesting debates about political subjects in the broadest possible way, and the hope is that those discussions will lead to some changes in the world. We're going to film, and then eventually, not tonight, you'll be relieved to know, but eventually we'll broadcast live on the internet so anyone can listen to our discussions. These are not commercial events. Please don't offer to pay or cause great offence. You're our guests here tonight. The pattern really is our guest speaker will talk for 45 minutes, or really as long as he wants to talk, and then there will be questions to him afterwards, but they don't have to be questions. There's quite a lot of people here tonight who are themselves experts in the field of medicine, so you can make a contribution, someone can respond to your contribution, you don't have to agree with anyone, you can say what you think. Sir Robert Boyd, well, I know many of you already know him. He's a world-famous paediatrician. He's been the head of St George's Hospital for 7 years. He went to St George's at the time when his son came to our chambers, and I've really got to know him through it. He has actually, apart from his medical achievements, got 3 wonderful children. Lucy, I'm pleased to say, is here representing the family tonight, and also his lovely wife Meryl is here, and I know many of you will already know all of them. So the format is Robert will talk for about 45 minutes, and then lots of discussion, perhaps going on for 45 minutes or an hour, and then afterwards everyone goes down below for the real purpose of the evening, which is a buffet cooked by our French chef. I'm very lucky here to have some really marvellous staff. We've got a very, very good French chef. He's been working since crack of dawn, so I got up for my morning run. He was there, so I think you'll have a good time down there, and lots of medicinal products in the basement as well. So, Robert, over to you.
Thank you. I'm losing my... Thanks. Good. Well, thank you, David, and thank you, a number of dear friends and relatives who are here, but thank you particularly the people who don't know me. Can you hear okay at the back? Thanks. David asked me to be provocative, and I'm planning to be provocative, but if I can... Am I losing my... Thank you. That's no, they've got to be in order, my dear chap. We don't want to several hemorrhage.
Why we're not broadcasting tonight.
Fine. I'll organise things. Also, there's the challenge that it's fairly dark. I probably can't read my notes anyway. So point 1 is medicine in 2050, and I really can't read my notes, so I'm going to move over a bit nearer the light.
Shall I get a lamp, Robert? I can get a lamp.
Okay, why not? It's just a slight boring old age. You can't see your notes. The unintended consequences of pursuing the ideal. And when I mention medicine, let me just say in passing, I today think, including nurses, including managers, including receptionists and ward maids. I mean, we're all in this together, and you can't just pick out medicine as an isolated issue. It is a challenge. When you have the challenge of old age, you can't quite see. Thank you. That's perfect. The man for the moment. Now, I think the real issue is what is the right ideal for medicine. And as I say, I'm going to be provocative so that there are a number of caveats you have to bear in mind. I'm white, I'm Western, I'm not a woman, I'm well-heeled, I've been extremely lucky in my career, and worst of all, I'm old. And the old are out of it. They remember the days when nurses... I've done fine. We've got electronics here. The old believed the days were good when the nurses spent their time putting the flowers out on the ward, and doctors had coffee in sister's office. Thank you very much. That's even better. And so bear in mind that I'm old when at a caveat. David asked me to be controversial or provocative, and the two conclusions I shall come to are that the NHS, far from having too little resource, probably has too much resource. And my second provocative thing is that the old have too much invested in them at the expense of the young. So those are the conclusions I'll come to at the end, but I want to give you my reasoning in the in-between. And in doing so, if I upset or offend any of you who are on drugs I criticize or treatments I criticize, please forgive me. My role is to be provocative, and if the old can't be provocative, who can be? A word about what I'm not going to talk about. I'm not going to talk about the triumphalist vision of medicine, of artificial intelligence, of genomics, of personalized magic bullets. The years I was a medical student, Watson and Crick published their paper on the structure of DNA. The year I was doing biochemistry as a student, Sanger won his first Nobel Prize for sequencing proteins, then later he sequenced DNA. And every year since then, which is some 60 years, the prediction of the magic bullet, the personalized medicine, has always been round the corner. It's a bit like the J-shaped curve of economics. The balance of payments will be right, but not till the year after next. And I think it's fair to say that to now, practically, not quite no clinical benefit, but practically no clinical benefit has accrued from 60 years of these aspirations. So just bear that in mind. I'm not going to talk about magic bullets. The second thing I'm not going to talk about is healthcare systems. The American system, the best hospitals in the world, the over-treatment of the well-to-do, to their disadvantage sometimes, the poor care for the chronically sick, and the worse care for the poor, and healthcare figures, despite spending, getting on for twice as much per head as we do, the lousy population figures. That's one healthcare system. I'm not going to talk about the healthcare system in Japan, which has the best longevity of any substantial country, but has, unlike us, fewer nurses than doctors, and has pretty grotty hospitals if you go around them. I'm not going to talk about the French, who often come out top in OECD reckons of healthcare systems, competing with the Brits for that, as a matter of fact. But when I rang up a French relative of mine not so long ago, no, she couldn't go to the doctor because they were on strike. All these different systems have their challenges, and I'm not going to talk about those today. My main risk is dropping my notes completely. What I want to do, sorry, there's a slight disorganization. I'm a bit like Theresa May with things falling off the back of the platform. Rather, I want to talk about the long view of medicine, the Hippocratic view. Thank you very much. You think your battery's going to run out? Okay, fine. I swear by Apollo, no sort of religious bias here. I swear by Apollo the healer, by Aesculapius, by Hygeia, by Panacea, and by all the gods and goddesses, that into whatever houses I enter, I will enter to help the sick. That I will use treatment to help the sick according to my ability and judgment, but never with a view to injury or wrongdoing. Whatsoever I shall see or hear in the course of my profession, as well as outside my profession, in my intercourse with men, if it be what should not be published abroad, I will never divulge, holding such things to be holy secrets. I promise to impart precept, oral instruction, and all other instructions to my own sons, the sons of my teachers, but to indentured pupils who have taken the physician's oath. That's the sort of long haul tradition, and bringing it rather more up to date. There was a lovely 19th century French thing, which I'm not going to try and say in French because my wife says I have a lousy accent, but it was the role of medicine is to cure occasionally, to relieve often, to comfort always. And I would add in to protect the health of the population as a fourth role of medicine. And I think that we need to bear those first three in balance in what we want for medicine in 2050. Now, you may think it's batty to downgrade the concept of curative medicine at a time of miracle cures, at a kind of targets for cure rates, and the focus on, inexorable focus on successful cures. But I think you've got to remember probably four things very clearly in mind that we so often forget, and our public and our citizens and our patients are not encouraged to remember. Point one, life is a fatal disease. Life is a fatal disease. Point two, half of neurosurgeons are below average, and half of nurses and half of pediatricians and half of professors of general practice are below average. Now, you can narrow the scatter around that average by draconian methods, by revalidations, by inspections, by X, Y, and Z. But the more you constrain the range around the mean, you also knock off the top half. You knock off Ronnie McKeith, the chap who developed the health care of disabled children. You knock off Michael Balint, a neurotic psychiatrist who made an enormous contribution to the, as well as the electronics. You knock off the Michael Balints of this world who made an enormous change to the nature of the consultation between citizen and doctor, patient and doctor. You knock off Cicely Saunders, the difficult woman who started palliative care to the great benefit, one of the great glories of post-war British medicine, and I could list many, many others. The chap who introduced renal dialysis, I remember Max Rosenheim, who was my consultant when I was a junior doctor, saying when somebody about the Royal Free, which was the first place to do dialysis, it came in from the RAF, but renal dialysis, it was a travesty of medical practice. You know, you constrain the outliers if you constrain getting rid of those who are below average, like half of us in this room are. Sorry about that. The third point I want you to bear in mind in looking for medicine, the ideal medicine of 2050, is marginal returns. Medicine tends to bring 90% of the benefit with 10% of the investment, and the more and more you invest, the little extra you get for the extra investment. One orthopedic surgeon, a generalist, can heal your fractures, do your this, do the other. You get an upper limb surgeon, he doubtless gets better results on the upper limb. You get a shoulder surgeon, he'll be even better on the shoulder. But you get the great bulk of the benefit by a general chap who can do most things. And particularly investment, the first 10% is really worthwhile if it's based on research knowledge. Let me give you two examples. I mean, it's a slight digression, but I think small things, cheap things that can make enormous difference. For many years, people died around the world of cholera. Infants in pediatrics, when I was first in the trade, kids up at the Whittington would die of infantile diarrhea because of dehydration. And across the world, hundreds of thousands of children died. And at a meeting, a guy who was treating such dehydration, you usually had to give intravenous fluids because they didn't absorb when you gave them fluids by mouth. But a gastrointestinal physiologist happened to be chatting to a guy who was dealing with diarrhea in the third world and said, "Did you know that if you look at the epithelium of the gut, water is absorbed when you have glucose and sodium there? And sodium was added to rehydration fluids, and it's transformed the world. People don't die of cholera now. They sip dehydration fluid. They don't die of infantile diarrhea." So a little bit of knowledge, cheaply applied, can transform the world. The other example is the MRC study of the epidemic of lung cancer, just at the turn of the first decades after the Second World War. And what was causing this epidemic? Was it tar in the roads? Tar painted on the skin causes cancer. Was it canned meat? Tinned food, transporting food from across the world? Was it that, the cooking facilities, why was this epidemic of this terrible disease? And I once heard Richard Doll say that when they did the study to try and look at the epidemiology of lung cancer, they put in cigarette smoking as a dummy variable. That nobody thought everyone smoked. Why should that have any ill effects? But we'll put it anyway. And he said when you broke the code, every single lung cancer was a smoker. I mean, it was... So a little bit of simple knowledge, that's added 10 years to the average lifespan of people in the UK. It's the biggest single reason for the increased life expectancy in the UK over the last 50 years. A little bit of knowledge, cheaply deployed, transformative. And the fourth thing I wanted to mention in saying we need to get our focus for medicine right is dissatisfaction. That our citizens, we've got this fantastically expensive Rolls-Royce system, even if you do wait a long time to get an appointment or whatever. But just look in most people's cupboards, they're full of alternative medicines, the enthusiasm for homeopathy, for cranial osteopathy, for many outside systems that the citizenry are not feeling that comfort and security, and people thirst for a label. So I think there are a lot of reasons for feeling that 2050 medicine needs a bit of a rethink. Now, what's the context for my sort of thinking? And I suppose it's one's life experiences in medicine. By the time you get to my age, you look back and then you try and look forward. I was born into a medical family. My parents were both medics, so that my sort of personal experience goes back about 100 years. They qualified not quite 100 years ago, and here am I pushing into my 9th decade. The year I was born, a woman was 100 times as likely to die in childbirth as she is today, 100 times. The year I was born, a quarter of the land surface of the world was red, the British Empire. The British Navy was twice as big as any other navy the year I was born. And early closing day was either Thursdays or Wednesdays. None of this weekend shopping or everyone closed at 5 o'clock. So it was a very different world. The year I graduated, or the year I was a student, I started being a student about 60 years ago, suicide was illegal. There was a note in UCH in the casualty department saying it is not the policy of the casualty department to inform the police if somebody comes in having taken an overdose. But it was illegal to attempt to commit suicide, never mind abortion or other more recent issues. Adults were allowed to beat, and nobody took much notice. They battered their children or sexually abused their children. It was either tolerated or ignored. It wasn't an issue in the frame. More specifically, when I was a houseman at the registrar at the Whittington, a child developing acute lymphoblastic leukemia had a 0.5% chance of being alive at the end of 2 years. And today, over 90% are long-term cures. So there have been a lot of changes. Hips, up at St. Pancras, there was a ward full of old women with fractured hips in what was called gallows traction, smelling of urine, demented with bed sores. Now you have your hip and you often go home the next day. So the scene has changed a lot. A woman having her first baby over 25 was an elderly primate, an elderly first pregnancy. Now people are having their IVF in their 40s. It's transformative. And I could go on, except to say there was also changes in the workforce. When I was a houseman up the road, notice man, a houseman up the road at UCH, I had 2 evenings off in my first 6 months as a houseman. Otherwise, I was there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The current fashion for work-life balance is very different. I must say it was bloody good fun. I enjoyed it thoroughly. But despite these enormous changes, I think that my parents, or even my parents' teachers, or Max Rosenheim, my first consultant, would have been feel quite at home in the present scene. The basic structure has not changed very much. The basic ethos has not changed much. There is much more long-term stability in the system than we tend to assume in these days of AI and so on. So, if I test medicine for the next 50 years or 30 years against its three roles: cure occasionally, relieve often, comfort always, with a bit of a side view on the population. Where do I think we need to readjust? And I think there are mainly issues to address are overreach, but there are also a few others as well. So let me pick up some areas of overreach that, in my view, eccentric old man's view, we need to pay a bit of attention to. One is our tendency to oversell our product, our overfocus on cure at the expense of the other domains. And this overfocus is driven at a sort of corrupt interface between us as a trade, a profession, and the public, and with various intermediaries contributing, made worse perhaps by the fact that newspapers can't afford journalists anymore, so that they make too much use of press releases. And to give you a sort of specific area of example, every medical charity issues its own press releases. So you'll get a press release one day about marvelous breakthrough in hearts, hoping the British Heart Foundation hoping to get more money. The next week you'll have a marvelous press release about the new cancer things, the Cancer Research Campaign, or whatever it's called now, trying to get more resource, and so on and so on. And most of these press releases aren't worth a bowl full of warm spit, to paraphrase Lyndon Johnson, because what is relevant to humans is actually the overall effect on quality of life, and secondly longevity, and whether there's some new gizmo or some new cancer drug is a tendency to oversell. Let me say that there was a report in the BMJ only last year of a review of cancer therapeutic agents, drugs of various kinds for cancer. And of the last 50 new medications for cancer approved by the FDA, the American Regulatory Organization, the median increase in life as a result of taking these 50 agents as a whole was 3 months, not 5 years, 10 years, 3 months. Now, that's not to say that there aren't dramatic benefits from some agents in some specific cancers, but if we're not overselling ourselves in the context of that sort of bit of data, I think we should look at ourselves. So that's overselling the product and not carrying the public with the weakness of our product, not reminding the public enough that life is a fatal disease. The second area I would criticize us for is normalizing the high tech. Pediatric intensive care units, and my trade was pediatrics. Pediatric intensive care units were introduced so that the acute nursing support for a child who came in with meningitis, with a bad road traffic accident or something like that, could really be supported and seen through and got better. 78% of the deaths in pediatric intensive care units now are children with life-limiting illness. They're children who are going to die anyway, and instead of dying in a hospice, which would be a much better location, they're dying in pediatric intensive care units. The shift into struggling for non-achievable cures is really got quite severe, and you get the same with adult intensive care units. You see in neonatal intensive care units, the 25 and 26-week-old babies mainly die, but if they live with ventilators and support and intensive nursing, many disabilities, including a cognitive disability of 25 IQ points, enough to move you from the average down to more or less uneducable, and quality of life measures very unsatisfactory. They've grown to adult life. You know, what are we doing? There are one or two ways in which we slip into high-tech medicine, and a personal sort of prejudice of mine is tube feeding. In the old days, if you became severely ill, you were dying, you couldn't drink anymore, you kept yourself comfortable, but you didn't slip a tube down. And the biggest change to not dying, whether you're a unsalvageable 26-week baby or a decrepit ninth decader, is putting a tube down. That's high-tech medicine. It's a major interference, but yet we've got in the cultural set that tube feeding is part of nursing care, and it moves a person from dying over a few days to perhaps lingering on for 5 years. For what? Have we got the focus quite right? And my third criticism of overreach is the medicalization of the more technical problems. David, I hesitate to criticize, but having a lectern which has a slit between the... Things were much better made in 1820. My third complaint about medical overreach is medicalizing medicalizing the social. Let me give you 2 examples. One is the relatively new diagnosis, shock horror scandal, inadequately treated, of ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I find it bizarre that if a child can't sit still in class, they should be given Ritalin. They feel better Ritalin. They fit in socially. We threw the Soviet Union out of the World Psychiatric Association because they drugged social dissidents. And I'm not clear there's any ethical difference between slugging social dissidents in the Soviet Union and slugging children so they can sit in a classroom. What an unnatural thing it is to put children into a classroom. Some cope with it. It's not appropriate for everyone. Is it really right to be criticizing parents for not, or teachers ringing up parents and saying, isn't it time that Tommy or Robbie went on Ritalin? It's usually a boy. To give you an example of how bizarre that is some slightly speculative data, but there are putative genes associated with ADHD, and somebody did a study of East African hunter-gatherers, and they found that hunter-gatherers who had the putative gene for ADHD were better nourished than hunter-gatherers who didn't have ADHD gene. The implication being that under some social circumstances, ADHD is a positive advantage. We've medicalized it. We've not said, should we have different schooling for some children? Another example is non-accident injury. I can't remember quite what I wanted to say about that, except that it's in spades an example of medicalizing the social. It's the idea that medicine can adjudicate and say whether somebody's beating up their kid or abusing their kid securely is an illusion. It's very, if you do the logic of it, either you're going to end up taking kids away who would be better left at home, or you're going to allow some kids to be murdered or abused who would be better taken into care. It is impossible to be certain where that boundary is, and I think there's an enormous sort of I used to chair the Camden Child Abuse Committee when I worked in London 30 or 40 years ago. It was a new, the clever young doctors spotted things. I can remember cleverly diagnosing a baby's marks. This mother must have mishandled this baby. Clever me, I knew the literature, and so we involved the social services, and we arranged for support for the mother and more closer supervision of the child. Within 6 weeks, the mother murdered the child. The pressure of being watched by them, people like me and my colleagues, tipped her over the edge. It's always stuck in my mind, it's not so clever to be so clever sometimes. So I'm skeptical about medicalizing the social. I think medical overreach is bad news. What about the doctors themselves? And by doctors I include the others, but I know more about doctoring than the other professions. How am I doing for time, David? My wristwatch is broken so that I have a difficulty. I went recently to a presentation by 3 medical students who were asked to talk about what they wanted the healthcare system they were going to qualify into to be in 5 years' time, in 15 years' time, in 25 years' time. And they gave very nice, interesting presentations. But all 3 of them said they were very concerned about burnout, and they wanted to know how they would avoid burnout, and they would keep work-life balance, and burnout was the big issue they saw ahead of them. And I find this a bizarre shift in a generation or two since I was young. And I wonder whether it comes out of a number of issues, one of which is this pursuit of perfection in the cure domain, the whole the move from internal satisfaction and internal responsibility for the healthcare professional to an outside validating, supervising. I think internal morale and internal enthusiasm is a really ultimately a more secure base for somebody delivering in the Hippocratic tradition than is the other. And I think you can get a counterproductive effect by overlooking, in the looking sense, health professions, so that even though you can get objective data, the bribing of GPs with quality associated points where you get extra money for ticking certain boxes, the evidence is that the healthcare in those boxes are ticked for improves, or certainly the recording of the healthcare, but that subjects that aren't being chased do less well. And I think, to my mind, the balance between supervision and personal conscience and enthusiasm is a key issue. The other thing, I think, and these were younger people, these three medical students, but it's true right through the early years of career, is the pressure we put on adults to midlife, to their 40s, compared to the life of Riley that the well-heeled elderly have. I appreciate they aren't all well-heeled, but there is it. So what do I conclude from all that? At the start, I made the controversial statement that the NHS had too much resource, if anything, not too little, and that may be counterintuitive, but I do remind you that healthcare is a bottomless pit, that ultimately everybody wants their private physician available 24 hours a day just for them, and the idea that society, it makes no difference. I mean, patients were dissatisfied when I was first in the trade. Citizens are dissatisfied now. People believe there was a golden age with just another 20 billion, or it should be 30 billion. But actually, it won't cut the mustard. There'll still be the same level of dissatisfaction. And from the 1940s to the 1980s, the proportion of public spending spent on the healthcare system tackled along between 9 and 10%. Since 1980, it's gone up to just over 18%. And do we really want 18% of our public spending to go on healthcare and more to come, when sixth form provision has been cut, the amount spent on sixth form for children has been cut by 20%, when we could be spending the money on, we had education in the Blair administration and in Gordon Brown, but actually the increased spending was on the healthcare system rather than education. Is that really the right balance for the future of our country and the future of our everything? There's so many things we could spend on: social support, poverty, etc., rather than the marginal returns of spending extra money in the healthcare system. Now, one other point before I finish. The healthcare system is overwhelmingly an old person's service. There's a blip around childbirth, and I've said what a success modern childbirth has been. There is a blip around the first 1, 2, or 3 years of life. But apart from that, the great sweep up of healthcare expenditure is those over the current retirement age. And why is this? I think it's, people talk about the complexity of old age, and we're all living longer and having more illness and so on. I think it's because we old go on having the vote, and that, this is where I'm being really controversial, that, we talk about women's suffrage, isn't marvelous? You've got universal suffrage, you hear every time on this and that with universal suffrage. It's complete crap. We don't have universal suffrage. Children under the age of 16 or 18, whatever it is this week, are disenfranchised. And we should either take the vote away from the old when they retire, or give extra votes to parents for children. I'm dead serious. I mean, I think there's a real constitutional imbalance that tips the whole system towards the old. And once we've got the vote for the young, I would recommend them to do the following. I would recommend them to suggest that there should be no old age pension. That when Lloyd George introduced the old age pension in the 1908 budget, mean age at death was 59, the pension kicked in at 75. Now it's more or less reversed, and we've become acculturalized to the idea of a holiday at the end of life. What nonsense. I mean, the people who need the holiday, they need the pressure taken off, are those from 25 to 40 with small children, and we should take that retirement holiday that half of you in the room are doing. I can't really see with my glasses on. We should take that retirement holiday and move it into a proper life balance for the 25 to 40-year-olds, so they're not both working flat out, nobody to look after the kids, stresses, strains. I'm glad to see one or two nods in the room. So that's my agenda for a perfection in a healthcare system that is genuinely ideal in 2050. David, I hope I've been controversial enough.